For 20 years, I believed she had died in the flames, until the day I received your letter. Hello, my friends. If you are a mystery lover, leave a comment telling us where you are watching from, okay? And remember to like and subscribe to the channel. The rain drummed on the slate roof like impatient fingers tapping on a coffin. In his modest cottage on the shores of the North Sea, Arthur Locksley maintained a silent ritual. The same black tea served at 7, the log fire lit even in late spring, and the newspaper folded beside the walnut walking stick that was as scarred as his soul. He was a man of silences and memories, with sunken eyes that had once peered into the darkest plots of the London underworld, but who now, at the age of 67, lived as a secluded ghost among books, dust, and the bitter taste of regret. That morning, the postman had not brought him propaganda or government news, but something far more cruel. A soot-stained envelope, sealed with brittle red wax like congealed blood. Arthur took it with trembling fingers, the smell of ash invading his nostrils before he had even opened it. When he recognized the handwriting, curved, elegant, a dance of letters his memory never dared erase, he felt transported 20 years into the past, as if time were bending in pain. Arthur, I'm still here. The burned mansion has trapped me in the ashes. Come before it's too late. The words written on that old, almost worm-eaten paper sounded like a whisper from beyond. Vivian Blackthorne, the name, which still weighed like a curse and a caress, was a wound that had never healed. She had disappeared in the fire that consumed Alabaster Hill, the Gothic mansion built of black stone in the Yorkshire woods. At the time, they said the fire had been accidental. They said she had never left the rubble. They said, but Arthur never fully believed it. There were nuances in that tragedy that disturbed him even in his dreams. Sitting in the armchair that she had once touched, he read and reread the letter until he had memorized every curve of the ink. Then, with a choked sigh of grief and impulse, he stood up. There was something in his bones, perhaps instinct, perhaps love, that told him she is alive, or something that pretends she is. The drive to Yorkshire was shrouded in fog and thought. At every turn on the narrow road, lined with oaks twisted like bony hands, Arthur revisited the days when he had loved Vivian under the weight of secrets. She was married to the powerful and dark Lord Blackthorne, and he was a young detective, headstrong and foolish enough to fall in love with a forbidden woman. The memory of her perfume, of her muffled laughter in the cold early mornings, of the whispered promises on the edge of moral abysses was still vivid, but more vivid now was the letter and the fact that someone, or something, was playing with the past. As he caught sight of the distorted silhouette of Alabaster Hill in the distance, amidst darkened hills and ancient mosses, his heart raced. What remained of the mansion looked like an exposed corpse. Black walls, mutilated towers, shattered windows. And yet, in a corner of the east wing, a flickering light filtered from behind a tattered curtain. Arthur squinted. Was it an illusion or an invitation? It was in the nearby village that he met Edith Morley, a young woman with her hair tied back in a messy bun and eyes that sparkled with the gleam of obsession. She recognized him even before he said his name. "You're Arthur Locksley, aren't you? The detective?" she asked, her breath coming out shallowly, as if she had been waiting for this meeting for years. She introduced herself as a historian, a researcher into the secrets of Alabaster Hill, fascinated by the disappearances and the legend of the woman who sang among the rubble. They say that on certain nights you can hear the melody of a music box coming from the ruins, she said. and Arthur froze. It was the same melody Vivienne had been humming, My Sweetest Sorrow. Edith insisted on accompanying him, but Arthur refused. This was personal. This was a deal with ghosts that only he had entertained for 2 decades. As Arthur stepped through the twisted gates, blackened like charred bones, he felt himself being swallowed by an ancient presence. The air was thick, heavy with the smell of burnt wood, mold, and something else. Something like scrap metal and rotting flowers. With each step he took through the devastated hallways, visions of the past seemed to overlap the ruins. A painting still hung crooked on the wall. A chair covered in a sheet swayed by itself in the wind that no one could feel. Arthur! The whisper was faint, almost indistinguishable from the sound of the boards. But he heard it and froze. The name had been spoken with the same melancholy sweetness as 20 years ago. He followed the sound like a dog hunting memories, through the main hall, where the charred staircase led, upstairs, and there, over the broken banister, lay a satin ribbon, purple, the same one she wore in her hair. Arthur, for the first time in years, felt fear, not of the supernatural, but what would happen if Vivienne were really there, and what would be left of her if she wasn't. The Alabaster Hill mansion exuded an almost living presence, as if the twisted walls themselves were watching Arthur, judging him for returning. He walked slowly, guided by memory and the persistent creak of the charred, wooden floor beneath his boots. The walls, once decorated with red tapestries and gilded frames, were now coated in soot and invasive vines. A tapestry hung partially burned, revealing behind it a secret door half open, a detail Arthur had never noticed on his past visits. A cold breeze escaped from the gap, bringing an incomprehensible whisper that made his hair stand on end. He did not know if it was the mansion that held its own mysteries, or if it was his mind, weakened by decades of guilt and longing, trying to animate the inanimate. But he kept going, because stopping meant admitting that he might be crazy, and he needed more than doubts to face this place. The door led into an old, partially intact library. The black-weathered shelves held books whose contents Arthur had never dared to explore. He recognized one particular volume, bound in faded purple leather, entitled The Craft of the Spirit in Stone, with the Blackthorn family crest engraved on the spine. He touched it, with just his fingertips, but did not have time to open it. A sound, almost imperceptible, rose behind him. Footsteps, slow, shuffling, but determined. Arthur turned abruptly, his heart racing, ready to scream, but the hallway was empty. The silence, however, had a new density, and then, like a cruel symphony, the music box began to play. My Sweetest Sorrow. He did not know whether to smile or cry. The melody pierced him like an ancient, familiar dagger. He approached the shelf, and there, on a ea stone pedestal, lay the box, intact, as if it had never faced the fire. The clasp was broken. It was open. It was ringing by itself. Arthur felt his knees weaken. The melody was not just a summons. It was an accusation. He knelt slowly, touching the varnished wood of the box as if touching a sacred shrine. Vivienne, he murmured, and the name escaped his lips like a forgotten prayer. But that moment, flashes of his youth invaded his mind with almost physical force. Their first stolen kiss in the conservatory, their furtive encounters in the greenhouse pavilion, the notes exchanged under the table in the great hall, while Lord Blackthorn lectured on politics. And then, the final memory. The fire, the flames rising like hungry snakes, the screams, her figure on the balcony, and the collapse of the West Wing. He had never been able to reach Vivienne. He had never found her in the wreckage. And now, The music box told him that she had never left. Climbing the stairs carefully, Arthur reached the second floor, where family portraits still adorned parts of the walls, like sentinels warped by time. Lord Blackthorn's face was covered in mould, but Vivian's remained strangely preserved. She looked at him from the painting with the same melancholy and haughty expression that had captivated him years before. The resemblance was so striking that Arthur wondered if time really did flow the same way in this place. As he turned a side hallway, he was surprised by a breeze that did not come from any window. And then he saw her, standing at the end of the hallway, wrapped in a grey dress that seemed made of mist, her hair tied up as in the past, her eyes fixed on his. "Arthur," she said, and her voice was a familiar echo, a memory whispered between sheets and promises. He did not know whether to run, flee, or surrender. "Are you really you?" he asked, his voice low. The woman smiled slightly, and there was something sweet and tragic in that gesture. "I don't know who I am anymore, Arthur, but I feel like you're the only one who can remind me of me." He approached slowly, each step as if he were sinking into quicksand. When he stood before her, he realized that her skin was as cool as marble, but her eyes, those amber eyes, still burned with the flame that had once destroyed him. Vivian touched his face with her fingertips. "Don't leave me here. Please. The house keeps me, but it also devours me. With each passing day, I remember less of what I was, and more of what it wants me to be." Arthur felt the world spin. Nothing made sense anymore, and yet everything in him screamed that this woman was Vivian, even if she wasn't, even if she was just an echo. "I came for you," he said, and in that moment he knew there was no going back. Vivian walked ahead of Arthur through the corridors of the East Wing, where the fire seemed to have spared some parts out of cruel caprice. The walls were covered in charred tapestries, and every now and then a door would close behind them, as if the mansion itself refused to let them go. She spoke softly, slowly, like someone relearning their native language. "The days blur together. Sometimes I feel like I've just woken up. Other times I think I've never slept." Arthur listened without knowing whether to believe her, but the way she looked at him, a mixture of pleading, tenderness, and contained terror, was unmistakable. It wasn't just any ghost. It was her, or at least what was left of her, and that was enough to keep him going. He felt himself once again drawn by the old spell she had over him, even now, when her touch felt colder than the wind howling through the cracks in the mansion. In one of the untouched rooms that had once been Lord Blackthorn's study, they sat side by side before a dead fire. There were ashes on the floor and old pages scattered about, covered in symbols Arthur did not understand. Circles and triangles and eyes and letters in languages he had never seen. Vivian watched them uneasily. "He said it was to protect me," she murmured almost to herself. "But it was prison. It always was." She told how, in the months before the fire, Lord Blackthorn had immersed himself in obscure texts, locked away for hours in the attic, talking to himself in voices no one could hear. And then came the rituals. Circles of salt, covered mirrors, black candles lit in the early morning. Vivian said she had fallen asleep one night and woken days later, no longer hungry, no longer thirsty, no longer aware of time. Since then, I have not grown old, Arthur, nor have I died. The house sustains me, and at the same time, it dissolves me. Arthur listened in silence, the weight of the revelation sinking like a stone into his chest. The old detective who had learned to separate the impossible from the improbable now felt the ground of logic crumble beneath his feet. "Why did you call me?" after all this time?" he asked. She turned her face slowly, her loose hair falling like veils over her shoulders. "Because I felt like I was forgetting who I was, and because you were the only man who saw me as I was. If I disappear completely, I want at least someone to know that I was here, that I was real." He couldn't answer. He just reached out and held her hand. For an instant, warmth returned to her cold skin, but the instant vanished like smoke. Outside, the sky grew darker, as if night itself was rushing to fall over Alabaster Hill. Then they heard footsteps on the main staircase, not shuffling, not imaginary, but steady, human. Arthur stood up suddenly, the old police instinct taking over. Vivian, by contrast, shrank back against the wall, like a shadow trying to disappear. When the study door opened, revealing the figure of Edith Morley, the surprise was mutual. "I said I would come after you," she said breathlessly. "You don't know what you're doing." Arthur frowned. "You followed me." Edith nodded. "And I brought something with me." From her bag, she took out an old diary bound in darkened leather, with the Blackthorn crest on the cover. "It's Lord Blackthorn's diary. I found it in the parish archives." She set the book down on the table with reverence and awe. "He knew what he was doing, Mr. Locksley. And what he did, it's still happening." Arthur opened the journal with trembling fingers. The pages were filled with a handwriting that was disturbingly steady, despite the madness that lurked between the lines. There were accounts of experiments with time, notes on life energy, summoning diagrams, and references to forbidden books like Liber Tenebris. But what caught his attention most were the last pages. In them, Lord Blackthorn described a ritual to keep Vivian young by binding her essence to what he called an arcane knot, a point of convergence between worlds that he claimed existed beneath the foundation of the mansion. "She will be eternal, and eternally mine," the last line read. Vivian trembled, taking a step back. "Has chained me to the house." Edith, for her part, looked fascinated. "If this is true, if this is still active, we stand upon a nexus of immortality." Arthur slammed the book shut. "Or damnation." The following night, armed with oil lanterns and wavering courage, Arthur, Vivian, and Edith entered an underground passage revealed by one of the diary entries. Behind the old bookcase of forbidden books was a false slab, covered in decades of soot. When they removed it, they found a spiral. Staircase plunged into darkness, reeking of damp and rusty iron. As they descended, the silence became almost solid, broken only by Edith's ragged breathing and the muffled thud of Arthur's boots on the damp stones. Vivian followed them with slow steps, as if each step sank her deeper into an invisible prison. The walls were covered with inscriptions carved in languages none of them knew. Spirals, closed eyes, and lunar symbols. "It all began down here," she murmured, her eyes lost in memories that seemed too vivid. At the bottom of the stairs, they found a vaulted chamber where time seemed to have dared not advance. In the center was an altar of black stone, the same as the mansion's foundation, and around it were circles of ash, small animal skulls, and candles petrified in their own tears. Arthur shone his light on one of the walls and held his breath. On it, etched in fire, was a female figure with her arms raised, wreathed in flames, her face vaguely resembling Vivian's. Beside it, the words "Non moriatur quae amateur," that which is loved does not die, burned in deep letters. Edith approached the altar reverently, leafing through the diary. Here is the ritual. This is it. Lord Blackthorn believed that true love could nullify death if connected to a point of power. Vivian pulled away, her body trembling. He said he loved me, but that was not love. It was possession. Arthur pressed his lips together, blood pounding in his temples. Everything he had learned about logic and deduction over the decades now dissolved in the face of this dark reality. If this ritual is still active, if it is sustaining you, Vivian, then there is an anchor. Edith nodded. Something that ties you to the house. It could be an object, a symbol, an emotional bond. If we find it and destroy it, perhaps you... She did not finish the sentence. Vivienne, her eyes brimming with tears, added, "Perhaps I can finally die." The silence that followed was heavy. Arthur felt the weight of that possibility sink into his chest like a hot iron. To release her would mean losing her again, but to keep her there would condemn her to an eternity of torment. It was a choice no man should have to make. Still, he knew the moment was coming. They rose back to the surface in a charged atmosphere. The mansion seemed more alive, as if it had sensed the incursion. The walls seemed to pulse, and at times a distant whisper snaked through the corridors, as if dozens of voices echoed in spectral harmony. Arthur walked ahead, determined to find whatever might serve as an anchor for Vivian. He remembered the music box, the satin bow, old letters she had written. All that is left of us is still here, he murmured to himself. Edith, for her part, seemed increasingly taken by a strange gleam in her eyes, an excitement that went beyond academic discovery. There was a subtle haste in her gestures, as if something was driving her to go beyond what was sensible. And when Arthur confronted her, she only replied, "You don't understand. This house holds secrets that can change everything. Time, life, death." That same night, Arthur woke with the feeling that he was being watched. The candle beside his bed flickered, and the music box, locked in his backpack, was open. The melody slowed, as if it were being dragged out by invisible hands. When he got up, he saw Vivian standing in the doorway, her hair disheveled, her eyes dark as coal. "They're calling me, Arthur. The voices. They say I should forget, that I should be someone else." He approached cautiously, trying to comfort her. But when he touched her, he felt her skin dissolve into ash for an instant. She recoiled, startled. "It wasn't me. Something used me. Something invaded me." Arthur knew in that instant that they were no longer dealing with a supernatural phenomenon, but with an entity that inhabited the house, feeding on love, despair, and broken promises. The next morning, Arthur awoke to a new, overcast sky and the nagging sensation that he had aged years in a few hours. The reflection in the mirror showed more than weariness. There was a shadow in his eyes that had not been there before. Vivian was not in the room, and there was no sign of Edith either. As he descended the creaking steps of the mansion, he felt as if each step echoed in multiple dimensions. Behind him, in front of him, all around him. The walls seemed darker, the paintings more distorted. The mansion, in its silent perversity, was changing. He found Vivian in the devastated greenhouse, kneeling among dead plants and shattered pots. She mumbled nonsense, some in Latin, some in languages Arthur had never heard. As she approached, she looked at him as if she did not recognize him. "Are you Arthur, or a memory of him?" she whispered, before collapsing in his arms. He carried her back to the old guest room, where the bed still had its sheets intact, or at least undamaged by time. When Edith reappeared, her eyes sunken and her hair loose, she revealed that she had spent the night studying her grandfather's diary. But something in her tone was wrong. There is a method to break the nexus, without destroying the bond, she said, not meeting their eyes. A way to extract the essence that keeps Vivian here and transfer it to another vessel. Arthur's eyes widened. Do you want to imprison her again? Edith hesitated. It's not imprisonment. It's continuity. The house will fall apart if the bond is broken. But if we channel it, we can preserve it. He stood up, his face burning. You're obsessed. This isn't science. It's madness. Edith simply replied coldly, You're talking as if you don't want her to live. The accusation fell like a blade. That night, Arthur's nightmares became fevered visions. He dreamed of the mansion as a living, breathing organism, with veins of stone and eyes in the walls. He dreamed of Vivian, walking through the burning halls, smiling with a mouth that was melting into ash. And he dreamed of himself, sitting in the library chair, growing older by the second as time around him receded. When he woke, his shirt was soaked with sweat, and his hands were covered in soot. Beside him, the music box was playing again, this time with the tune reversed, dissonant. Vivian stood at the foot of the bed, her eyes dull. You're killing me, Arthur, she said, her voice 3 people at once. You can't let me go. He wept, not out of fear, but because he knew it, or was true. The next day, Arthur gathered what strength he had left and decided to explore the mansion's attic, a place that Lord Blackthorne had kept locked even in times gone by. Using a rusty key from his diary, he forced open the chained door. The air inside was thick, like that of a tomb. Stacks of books piled high to form small, makeshift altars, and on a central table stood an oval mirror covered in a red cloth. When he removed the cloth, Arthur found himself staring at his reflection. But it was not the present. It was himself, decades younger, standing next to Vivian, alive, smiling, arm in arm with him in the garden. When he blinked, the reflection disappeared, and in its place was only the shadow of Lord Blackthorne, with his back turned, whispering words in an impossible language. Arthur took a step back. The mirror trembled. He hasn't left, Vivian said, appearing in the doorway, pale. Part of him is still here, and he uses me. With this revelation, Arthur understood that the mansion did not merely imprison Vivian. She was the link between the 2 worlds, the puppet of the never-ending ritual. Every emotion he felt fed her presence, and every memory reinforced the mystical bonds that kept them between the real and the impossible. You love me, Arthur, but love is not always about saving. He touched her face, which crumbled like dust and then reformed in an instant. Maybe I need to die, so that you can live, she whispered. Arthur, desperate, felt torn between his rational nature and the uncontrollable desire to have her again. But deep down, he knew that true love is not possession. It is liberation, and that the price of keeping Vivian alive could be the destruction of everything, including herself. The mansion began to shake the next morning, as if it sensed that the veils were about to be torn away. Arthur, Vivian, and Edith were back in the great hall, where the cracked marble floor was split into jagged crevices. The light that filtered through the windows was no longer natural. Tinged with a sickly gold, it seemed to come from another sky. Edith, Lord Blackthorne's journal open in her hands, was chalking a summoning circle around the library altar, the very one where Vivian's essence had been bound. If we do this correctly, she can be transferred to a new vessel, free from the temporal curse, she said fervently. But Arthur did not move. He watched Vivian, sitting silently at the foot of the stairs, as if she had already accepted her fate. This is not what she wants, he whispered. Edith did not respond. Her eyes shone with something between ambition and blind faith. Vivian stood up slowly and walked toward Arthur, each step lighter, as if her body were already falling apart. I feel the cracks inside me, she said, placing her hand on his chest. The house is calling me. It wants to use me again. And when it's done, it will use you. Arthur squeezed his eyes shut, suffocated by the dilemma. All his life he had sought rational answers, solid certainties. But here, before the woman he had loved and lost, before the shadow of a love that had transcended logic, there was no deduction that could save him. There was only what was right, and what was necessary. He held her hands tightly. You called me here, so that I could remind you of who you were. But maybe I am the one who needs to remember who I am. And I am the one who swears never to imprison you again. Vivian smiled, fragile as a memory about to disappear. Edith, noticing Arthur's hesitation, stepped forward with the diary in her hand. You don't understand. She's the key. If we miss this chance, all this energy, all this power will be lost. Arthur turned to her with cold calm. You want what my love does not, and what your line seeks is control, not redemption. Edith shouted something unintelligible and began chanting words from the diary. The air grew thick. The house vibrated like an underground drum, and the candle flames flared up on their own. Vivian screamed, staggering back. She's pulling me! Arthur rushed to Edith, snatching the book from her hands and throwing it into the grate. The flames exploded blue and gold, illuminating the room with an almost heavenly violence. Edith fell to her knees, weeping. You don't understand. I could have changed everything. But Arthur knew. He knew that what defies death never comes without a price. With the diary destroyed, the mansion began to crumble, with solemn slowness. The walls contracted, the paintings screamed in silence, and the mirrors trembled with alternating reflections of past, present, and absence. Arthur pulled Vivian close to him. She seemed lighter, almost translucent. It's ending, she said with a sigh that seemed like the end of a season. The house is falling apart, and I with it. Arthur cupped her face with both hands. If I'm going to lose you, let it be to set you free. She smiled, and in that moment, she was the same woman who had taken his breath away in the greenhouse gardens so many years before. Kiss me, one last time, she whispered. He obeyed, and the kiss was like a seal, a broken pact. A circle finally closed. When their lips parted, Vivian dissolved into soft soot, carried away by the wind escaping from the cracked walls. The structure of the mansion began to crumble under the weight of centuries of secrets. Arthur barely had time to run through the shattered corridors, carrying the music box under his arm, as stones and beams fell all around him. Edith, silent, followed him in shock. The floor opened up where the altar had been, and a flash of light enveloped the entire room in a light that seemed to sing. Arthur ran to the main entrance, where the rusty gates closed of their own accord as he crossed the threshold. A final, dull, dry crash, and everything gave way. Alabaster Hill had fallen. What had once been a monument to decay was now just a heap of smoking ruins among silent hills. And in the wind, among the dry leaves, a whisper could be heard, or perhaps a song. My sweetest sorrow. Days passed before the locals found Arthur, unconscious, amid the rubble of what had once been Alabaster Hill. He lay beneath a fallen beam, miraculously unharmed, the music box still clutched in his arms like a talisman. When he opened his eyes, he saw the grey Yorkshire sky above him, clear for the first time in weeks. Is it over? He murmured, unsure of who he was asking. He was taken to a local hospital, where he refused to say much, only repeating that the house fell because it was time. Edith also survived, but mysteriously disappeared a few days later, leaving behind only the blackthorn crest necklace in a drawer at the inn. No one saw her again. The story spread through the village, mixed with legend, and soon no one could tell fact from superstition. But Arthur knew. He knew everything. He returned to Whitby a few weeks later, thinner, more stooped, but with a strange serenity in his eyes. His cottage was as he had left it, untouched, melancholy, and silent. He cleaned the grate, changed the wood, and returned to his habit of tea at 7. But something had changed. No longer a man in waiting, but someone who had come full circle. One rainy afternoon he began to write. The words flowed as never before. He did not relate the story as a detective, but as a man who had witnessed the inexplicable and survived his own heart. He called the manuscript The Ashes of Alabaster Hill. He had a discreet run printed at a country printer and distributed copies only to second-hand bookshops, with no author's name, no inscription. It is a confession, he told himself, and a farewell. But the past does not give in so easily. On certain nights, when the wind blows in from the sea and the fog covers the windows, Arthur wakes up to the sound of the music box, even though it is locked in a drawer. The melody sounds low, almost timid, but it is unmistakable. My sweetest sorrow. On those nights, he lights the fireplace and speaks to the emptiness, as if someone were still there. I let you go, Vivienne, and I hope you have found peace. Sometimes he thinks he hears a soft laugh, a whisper behind the curtain. Other times he sees the reflection of a figure in the hallway mirror. He is not afraid, not anymore. The fear passed with the mansion. Now there is only a longing that does not hurt, or at least not like before. A longing that accompanies him, like a gentle ghost. One day, he found a dried flower inside the music box. It was a camellia, the same flower Vivienne used to wear in her hair. He didn't tell anyone. He just smiled, like someone who has just received a letter from a faraway place. From that moment on, Arthur started to leave the bedroom window ajar. He said it was for the air, but he knew, deep down, that it was a gesture of courtesy, an invitation. If you ever want to come back, I'll be here, he would murmur, and every night, before going to sleep, he would wind the box, even though he knew it would play on its own. It was the ritual of someone who hasn't forgotten, but has learned to live with the memory, the kind of memory that whispers, not shouts, that warms, even if made of ashes. The following spring, the first spring that had seen flowers bloom in the garden since his return, Arthur walked to the cliff behind the cottage. He carried a small wooden box wrapped in blue cloth. He buried it quietly beneath the shade of an ancient willow tree. Inside were the letters Vivienne had written to him before the fire, the satin ribbon he had found on the steps, and a copy of his book. "This is where you will rest now," he said, kneeling down. The wind blew hard, making the leaves dance around his body, and for a brief second he felt hands touch his shoulders. No one was there, but Arthur was not surprised. He simply closed his eyes and smiled, as if recognizing an old presence. Then he got up with effort and went back to the house where the fireplace was waiting, lit by invisible hands. In the months that followed, Arthur was seen less and less in the village. The few who met him on their afternoon walks along the cliffs said that he seemed to be talking to someone beside him, even though there was no one there. Some said he had lost his mind. Others, more sensitive to the stories that whisper among the Yorkshire hills, preferred to believe that he was talking to ghosts, and especially to one. Some children swore they had seen from the road a woman in a grey dress sitting under the willow tree, combing her hair with an ivory comb. The Lady of the Cinders, they began to call her. And like everything in old villages, the story took shape, became part of the place. It was told in the taverns with more reverence than mockery. Arthur's manuscript, although published anonymously, gained notoriety among collectors of cursed books and scholars of the occult. A professor at Durham University published an article in which he analysed the work as a perfect allegory of grief and attachment. But he also mentioned in footnotes that details of the story coincided with archived police reports of a real fire that occurred in 1912 at the Blackthorn estate. Too curious to be coincidence, he concluded. Other copies of the book disappeared from the shelves, as if sucked by time itself. Booksellers said that it would move by itself, or that sometimes, when leafed through, it would give off a faint smell of burning. Readers, upon finishing the last page, almost always reported the same thing: the feeling of being watched by someone who loved them and who did not want to be forgotten. One night, during a storm that seemed to have been ripped from the pages of history itself, the music box rang louder than ever. Arthur, too old to run, followed the sound with slow steps to the back room, where the oval mirror with its cracked frame had been propped for years. Melody stopped the moment he touched the frame. There was no reflection in the glass, only the image of a hallway in the mansion, clean, lit by candles, and in the background, Vivienne, with her back to him, walking toward the darkness. "Wait," Arthur murmured, and for a moment she stopped. She turned, she smiled, and disappeared. The mirror cracked, as if a tear of glass had run down its corner. Arthur sat there. For how long he didn't know, just listening to the silence, as if it were telling him everything he still needed to hear. From that day on, Arthur never spoke her name out loud again. He began to refer to her when necessary, only as the memory that kept me alive. He stopped writing, stopped seeking explanations, stopped trying to make the world understand what the world would never understand. He became part of the mystery himself, an old man in a house by the sea, who fed the fire every night, left the window open, and wound a music box that no longer needed winding. His eyes, although tired, held a silent flame, not of hope, but of memory, of timeless love, and above all, of acceptance. He knew that some stories never end. They just rest, waiting to be told again, when the right wind blows through the right cracks. Last winter, Arthur didn't light the fire. He was found sitting in the armchair, a blanket over his knees, an open book on his lap. He was smiling. The doctor said his heart had stopped like a flame that goes out without a crack. Cure. The table next to him was a note with a few handwritten words. To free is not to forget. It is to love without holding on. The music box was closed, but when the paramedics moved it, it played a single note. Loud, clear, lonely, like a goodbye. The cottage remained closed for years, until it was bought by a young writer who said she had dreamed of the house for months. When she entered, she said she could smell camellias and ashes. In the mirror in the hallway, she saw a figure that disappeared when she turned her face. And that night, when everyone was asleep, she heard the box play, a soft melody, full of sadness and tenderness. Years later, the ruins of Alabaster Hill still remained closed, overgrown with ivy and silence. The place had become the stuff of legend, one of many places in England where stories refused to die. Tourists avoided the nearby trails, and even hunters and occultists rarely went past the entrance, overcome by an inexplicable sense of revulsion. Some nights, locals would report hearing distant laughter among the hills, or a sad song dancing in the wind. The authorities never authorized excavations. The ground was unstable, they said. But those who knew the story, or believed it, had another explanation. It was sacred, or cursed, which is, in the end, the same thing when it comes to eternal love. Arthur's book, The Ashes of Alabaster Hill, became a rarity. Collectors sought it as an artifact rather than as literature. It was said to change its cover by itself, to reveal new pages under certain phases of the moon, and to induce vivid dreams of stone corridors and mirrors without reflection if read aloud. One copy was found sealed in a lead box in an Edinburgh antique shop, with a handwritten posthumous inscription, "To him who dares remember, remember kindly." Another turned up in Paris, in an abandoned convent, where the nuns who had lived there had written of a lady who sings within the walls. No satisfactory explanation was ever forthcoming. But the story, like all true stories, lived on. The young writer who bought Arthur's cottage became famous after publishing a collection called The Voices of the Sea and the Ashes. In interviews, she said she was inspired by a recurring dream about a man with sad eyes who guided her through a ruined house, always with a woman at the window, waiting for someone who never came. She never revealed the man's name, nor the woman's, but in one of the stories, she described a music box that played by itself, always the same tune, even without a winding. A reader noticed the similarity with the legend of Alabaster Hill and, in a letter, asked the author if she knew the place. The answer came with a single sentence: "Some places don't need to be visited to be remembered." On the 50th anniversary of the fire, a group of documentary filmmakers tried to film a special about the mansion. They brought equipment, cameras, drones, and sensors. However, the material was never released. What they saw there, or what they believed they saw, was enough to end the project. In an unofficial interview, one of the technicians confessed that the main camera recorded the same section of a corridor in ruins for hours. But when he reviewed the material, the footage showed scenes that had never been captured before. A couple dancing, a kiss on the balcony, a woman screaming in flames. The tape was destroyed. The technician never worked with images again. It is said that today he lives in seclusion on the coast, collecting mirrors covered with sheets. And so, Arthur Locksley entered history, not as the brilliant detective of the classic London cases, but as the man who loved too much. His name has disappeared from the newspapers, the records, and the popular memory. But every now and then someone finds his book in a forgotten second-hand bookshop, or reads an old letter with a shaky signature in blue ink. And when that happens, the wind blows differently, the sky darkens for a moment, and the music box, tucked away somewhere in the world, plays again. One note, two, then silence, as if Vivian were listening, as if to say, "I am still here." In a distant future, when everything is ruin and dust, perhaps the bones of Alabaster Hill will still hold the last memory of a kiss that has stood the test of time. Perhaps some archaeologist will find, among the black stones and moss, Vivian's satin ribbon, still lilac, still scented, or perhaps nothing will remain. Perhaps love, like music, lives only as long as someone remembers it. But even that is enough, because the love that defied death needs no more proof. It simply is. And if someone passes through the hills and hears, in the depths of silence, a sad song, let him listen with an open heart, because it is there, between the invisible and the eternal, that the ashes of a love that did not want to die rest. A love that chose to exist between worlds, without time, without a body, only memory, only feeling, only her and him, the lady and the detective, Vivian and Arthur, between the mist and the embers, between the end and the beginning. If you liked this story, subscribe to the channel leave a like and activate notifications so you don't miss future content. See you later.